My name is Melody Hackett. I'm the Director of Sales for 84 Lumber. I've only been in this role for about 3 or 4 months. I've been in the building industry for 34 years. My last job was Vice President of Eagle Construction. And I just one day decided that I just didn't want to be on that side anymore. So I thought, I'll just try something new. So I did, and it's been very, very good for me. And I love participating in home builders, and I'm so glad that 84 Lumber was able to sponsor the breakfast, and we also have a booth as well. So now I'd like to introduce the renowned political scientist, Dr. Bob Holsworth. Bob Holsworth is one of the leading political analysts in Virginia. He is the regular political analyst for WTVR CBS 6 in Richmond, and his commentary on Virginia and national politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and newspapers throughout the nation. He has appeared on most major American TV networks, as well as the BBC and Fuji Television. He was named one of the most 100 influential in Virginia politics by campaigns and election magazines. Holsworth is the founding director of the Center for Public Policy and Dean of the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. He's a managing principal in DecideSmart, a firm that provides analyst and planning assistance to agencies, local governments, nonprofits, and private sector companies with governmental interests. Please welcome Bob Holsworth.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. I was here, I think last time I met you, we were at the Greenbrier prior to the legislative elections in 2023. And at that time, I know everybody was talking about the importance of electing David Owen to the delegate. And so if you could, you were very successful there. So here's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to start really just by giving an overview of the presidential election this year, talk about some of the issues that have emerged in the presidential election that are relevant to home builders, I think. And then after that, I'd like to talk about the implications of the results of the presidential election for the upcoming elections in Virginia next year as well. And then I hope I can take a few questions as well, if I have enough time for that. So let's start with the presidential election, which already is an election year like no other that I can imagine. We started off with an incumbent president who wanted to run despite the fact that 60 to 70% of the Democrats were saying they thought he was too old to be their standard bearer, but the leadership of the party was basically going to support him. And then you had that debate, the horrible debate, and ultimately pushed out by essentially Nancy Polisci, I think, who basically said he couldn't be our standard bearer any longer. So we had that happen. We've had 2 assassination attempts at the Republican candidate and the former President Trump. And then even last week, we saw in one of the battleground states, Republican candidate for governor, they came out with a story that he'd been frequenting porno sites in which he called himself the Black Nazi on this front. So we've just never seen kind of an election year like we're seeing. I don't know what's going to happen over the next 40 days, but obviously we'll have some more surprises as well. So let me talk a little bit about this election in terms of the candidates and then the polling and then the issues as well. So what we have here right now is that when Biden got out, the Democrats united immediately around Kamala Harris. And the Democrats were taking what they thought was a calculated risk. But they had come to the conclusion, which I think is correct, that Joe Biden couldn't win. That by and large, what you had is that you had 60 or 70% of the public had said they really didn't want either of these candidates running, but there was sort of a little difference in how it was moving in each party. In the Democratic Party, what had happened early on is that a lot of the polls of the Democrats were saying, we really think he is too old, that we shouldn't run him. But the leadership was saying too much of a risk to go with somebody else until that debate occurred, and that happened. On the Republican side, there are a lot of Republicans who privately say in leadership, really don't like this guy. But what they are frightened of is that he has a base that is extraordinarily loyal, that the MAGA base just is not, hasn't moved and won't move, and if they get too far out in front, they may have a primary against them. And Trump has been very successful in some of these primaries in removing Republicans who have opposed him, like we've seen in Virginia with Congressman Bob Good losing to John McGuire in a Republican primary. So each side was they're not in love with their candidate, but the Democrats ultimately decided they had to take this calculated risk because Biden couldn't win. And they were worried that not only would it cost them the presidency, but it would be a landslide in the Senate, and they wouldn't be able to retake the House at all. So for that pragmatic reason, they decided to take this risk. And the only way they could do it at this time was to really just go to the Vice President Kamala Harris, who a lot of Democrats were skeptical of. However, what they have found from Harris since she has gotten into the race is that she's done quite a good job for them. That if you take a look at this, she had a very successful speech at the convention, had a fabulous debate in which almost everyone thought that she emerged victorious in that debate. And if you look at what's happened in some of the polls about her approval rating, which was sort of down with Biden in the 30s, has now gone up to the mid-40s and sometimes even over 50%. So in terms of what people are thinking of her personality and her approval, she has done a remarkable job in a couple of months. That in terms of the issues that she's trying to focus on, basically what you see is this, that on one hand, she's trying to push what the Democrats believe is their absolutely strongest issue, and that is reproductive rights, abortion, running against the fact that Trump appointed the Supreme Court justices that did the Dobbs decision that essentially basically threw the abortion issue back to the states. And the Democrats are running on that because they've been very successful in many state elections since that decision in either referendum or special elections, where they've been winning even in very conservative states, such as Kentucky, Ohio, and the like. They've been running there. So Harris has really latched onto that issue as very, very positive issue. At the same time, she's trying to, in some ways, reduce the advantage that Donald Trump had on some other issues, whether that be immigration, whether that be the economy, by talking about how she wants to improve the middle class and trying to paint Trump as a supporter of the more affluent class. So that has been the essence of her campaign, is really to argue on reproductive rights, to suggest that she's going to be a different kind of leader than Trump, less chaos, more normality, and then try to find a way to cut into the margins that he has on some of these big issues that really are determining how people vote in many ways. Donald Trump, on the other hand, to just go there, if you take a look at what his campaign was about, on one hand, he's still mad that Biden's not the nominee. That Trump is probably furious with his advisors who told him to do a debate before the Democratic convention. Because imagine what this situation would have been if the Democrats had nominated Biden and then they had a debate in September and you had the June debate occur in September. Trump would think he's home free in this sense. So basically what you see with Trump, unlike Harris, he has these approval ratings that are around 46, 47%, and they don't move very much. but he finds it very hard to move them up. It's hard for him to become more popular, given that he's been around for 8 or 9 years. So he has about a 47% approval rating, 53% disapprove of him. And he can't move that up very much. So in his campaign, he's focusing on 2 things. The first is he wants to try to find the way that he can bring Harris down. I was watching his speech in Pennsylvania yesterday. He's calling her a communist. Do you want this communist here? Trying to find every way that he can bring, if he can't move up, the other thing you do in politics is you bring the other person down. And he's trying to do that. And then secondly, he wants to focus on the issues that he thinks is most important for him, whether that be the economy, talking about inflation, talking about what had happened in the price of goods over the last 4 years that had really, in many ways, sealed Biden's fate. It was sort of the inflation and the public disapproval of that really caused Joe Biden big problems. He kept wanting to talk about what he had accomplished, but even if you agreed with what he had accomplished, the public wasn't buying it at the time. And then secondly, Trump is going back to the issue that got him elected in the first place, and that is immigration. Whether he's talking about Springfield, and he's not going to back down. So he made the comment about they were eating the cats and the dogs at the debate. He lost the debate, but he's still there. He said, saying, I want to go back to Springfield. I want to go to Aurora, Colorado. I want to go to every place there. And last night, again, he's talking about send them all back. As we're saying, that's what we're going to do. We're going to send them all back. And he's going to do what he called mass deportation. In the polling, that gets about 52% of the public agree that they want to do, at least in sort of the general terms. And so those are the kind of things that he is talking about. In the economy, mass deportation, it's going to be, I'm going to bring everything back, and there won't be any of these foreign wars any longer that we now are on the edge of having ourselves, but which we are involved with financially on that front. Last night he said, Zelensky, he's the best salesman in the world. He says every time he comes to Washington, we give him $60 billion there. He said, that won't happen any longer with me. So we have Trump in this particular way, Harris there. And what are the polls saying right now? And it's very interesting to look at these polls. That nationally, Harris has kind of eked ahead in the national polls. Sometimes it's 1 point, sometimes it's 2 points, sometimes it's 4 or 5 points in the national polls. However, the national polls are meaningless because the president is elected, as you know, by the states through the Electoral College. So what that means is that even though there is a 50-state election, probably 40 to 43 of those states are already accounted for. And all of the energy at the moment is in 7 states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. That's where they're fighting the campaign in these 7 states. And those battleground polls are quite even. That it looks as if Harris has a slight lead in those northernmost states, Trump doing pretty well, slight lead in the Sun Belt states. But the other thing I want to mention about that is that when you get to these somewhat close elections, the polling you have to take with a great grain of salt. And the reason you have to do that is not because they're not smart, not because they're not trying to do their best, but because of just the very nature of polling carries with it a certain sort of standard error that's going to occur no matter how good you are at it. It's become, first of all, it's become more difficult to poll, right? Who answers the phone any longer from a number that you haven't seen? Very difficult to get people on. So they're doing all kinds of different things. They do some phone, some text, some internet, some what they call panels. So they have all these things that they're trying to do to make up for the fact that nobody answers the phone any longer. But secondly, even after that, the essence of every poll about an election has a degree of uncertainty to it. And here's how it happens. Like when they start polling like a year before the election, very often they're just polling what they call all adults. And what we know is that all adults aren't registered to vote. So as you get closer to an election, maybe 3 months out or 6 months out, they start polling what they call registered voters. And that's easy to do in most states because you can buy a list of registered voters and you call them. But the other point is that we know is that at the end of the day, registered voters aren't always voting themselves, that there's a percentage of registered voters who don't vote. So now you're down to trying to poll what you call likely voters. And when you try to poll likely voters, that's where the uncertainty comes in. Because everybody then is making some calculation about what percentage of these groups are actually going to vote. We know some groups are going to vote pretty large numbers, right? People over 65, they vote. We know that people with college degrees and advanced college degrees, they vote in large numbers. But then when you get down to folks who have less education, where you have people who may have only been intermittently involved in politics, they may vote in smaller numbers or larger numbers. There may be a variation. And in every poll, they have to model in some fashion who's actually going to be in that electorate come election day. And they can miss. In 2016 and 2020, they missed by underestimating Donald Trump's vote. They missed in 2016 because they underestimated what we might call the white working class and rural vote in this country. They participated at a far higher level than most of the pollsters believed. In fact, Hillary Clinton's pollster didn't believe it. Because if you look back at that election where she lost some of what they call those blue wall states, she lost Wisconsin and never went there. never, campaigned in Wisconsin. Why not? Because her pollster told her, you got Wisconsin. You're going to win by 8. You're going to win by 10. They didn't do that. In 2020, the same thing happened, but not quite as badly for the Democrats. So Biden was able to win, even though the polls also underestimated his vote, Trump's vote, in those states. So there are some people who believe that that's going to happen again this year, that in 2024, come election day, you're going to see that the polls underrepresented Trump or overrepresented Harris. I was just talking to someone, right before breakfast here, and we were talking about who's going to win. I said, it's very close. He said, well, I don't like those. I don't believe the polls. I think that at the end of the day, Trump voters are going to come out more. On the other hand, the Democrats are saying, hey, wait a second. In 2022, in the congressional elections and in all these special elections, what we're finding is that far more women are coming out and young people to vote on that Dobbs decision situation, that they're going to come out and vote there. So there's no reason to believe that in 2024 it's simply going to be a repeat of 2016, 2020. So that's why this election is such kind of a toss-up there, because we know the polls seem to be relatively even, but we don't know what it's going to look like. Is it going to look again like 2016, 2020, where Donald Trump will outperform the polls? Or will it look by 2022 and all these special elections where the Democrats are outperforming the polls. Don't quite know on that front. And so for that reason, which I don't mind, we're going to not wait for the polls. We're going to wait for the actual election this time and not think the polls are going to tell us who's going to win and who's not going to win on that front. Now, let me talk about Virginia for a little bit. Virginia at one time been a battleground state, and we were thinking it might be a battleground state this year, but we're not so sure right now, and the candidates really aren't campaigning here. That when Joe Biden looked to be the Democratic nominee, Virginia really looked in play. Every poll had Virginia even, Trump up one, Biden up one, because Biden's approval rating in Virginia was in the 30s, despite the fact that he had carried Virginia by 10 points in 2020. In 2021, however, Glenn Youngkin won the governorship by about 2 points himself. So people were thinking, well, what kind of state is Virginia now? Is it a blue state? Is it moving red? Is it a purple state? What is it here? What kind of state we are? And a lot of it was trying to decide what was the meaning of Glenn Youngkin's election in 2021 when he won. Was that a one-off, or was that an indication of a deeper change in Virginia? My sense was that that was actually a little bit of both. It was a one-off because the 2021 election was really the COVID election in Virginia. It was right after all the COVID lockdowns, and what happened, I thought, was that parents were sick of 18 months of remote learning for their kids not being in the schools. And Youngkin was able to attach that to this parents' right issue, but it was really a deeper issue of just parents in this foul mood of like 18, this is crazy. What's going on with these kids on Zoom? You had some parts of the state where the kids had to go to Wendy's because they didn't have internet access to do their homework. It just made no sense. And so Youngkin was able to win. That's kind of the one-off part. The other part of it, however, is that something else has occurred in Virginia over the years, and that is there is a great disparity in votes now simply by where you live in Virginia. It's a trend been going on for some time, but it's there. People in my business like to say, do you live in a Whole Foods county or a Cracker Barrel county? On that sense there. Like, where do you live? But what it means, like if you live in Northern Virginia, it is a blue area, region of the state. There are no delegates in the General Assembly from Fairfax County. There's one who represents part of Prince William or Loudoun, I think. That's it. Then, however, if you go out west, there are no Democrats. You can't find them. That what has happened is that places where the Democrats used to get 40% of the vote or 35% of the vote, they get 20% of the vote. They get 15% of the vote out in the far southwest. If you go to what I call the Liberty University suburbs, outside of Lynchburg, Campbell, and Bedford, they get 21% of the vote there. And I think that drop-off is going to stay there for a while on that front. So Virginia has become this kind of very interesting state where Northern Virginia is this way. A lot of RVA, with the exception of Hanover and Goochland, have gotten more Democratic there. Henrico has, Chesterfield has. Chesterfield's now purple, used to be dead, absolutely red. And Hampton Roads, however, is still very, very purple, can kind of go either way. But what you see in Virginia is these kind of divisions that have occurred. Now, what does this election mean for Virginia next year? Because here's the situation. We have in Virginia an election every year. Next year, we have all our House of Delegates folks up for re-election. They get elected every 2 years. Delegate Owen's just looking forward to that, I know. The Senate is 4 years, so they're not up for election. But The governor is up for election, and Virginia is the only state where the governor can't secede himself. So we've had this odd thing that's occurred in Virginia for the last 40 years. With the exception of the time that Terry McAuliffe won in 2013, every time there's been a Republican president, there's been a Democratic governor elected the next year, and vice versa. Every time the Democrat's been elected, there's been a Republican governor for next year. So Virginia is having a critical election next year for this reason, not only because of what I said about the House of Delegates and the governor, but it's going to determine the balance of power in Virginia. So right now, Virginia has what we call divided government. We have a governor that's Republican, and we have a House of Delegates and a state Senate that are controlled by the Democrats on this front. So because there's no state Senate races, it could be some special elections, in all likelihood, the Democrats will retain control of the Senate. And so what's going to happen next year in Virginia, in my mind, is likely to be determined by what happens at the presidential race to some degree. And this is the degree which I think is fairly certain. If Donald Trump wins the presidency, I don't think the Republicans can win the governorship in Virginia next year. Because when he won in 2016, the ensuing years in Virginia were a debacle for the Republicans. They got killed in the governorship of 2017. 2019, the Democrats took control of both chambers. They had unified government. And so that is going to be a problem for the Republicans because Donald Trump is not so popular in Virginia, and he's not at all popular in the most populous area of the state, which is Northern Virginia. Because remember, he said he wanted to drain the swamp. And a lot of people in Northern Virginia consider that an economic assault on that part of the state. You know, I was giving a talk like that to Republican delegates a number of years ago, and Kirk Cox just got up and said, well, that is the swamp there. But, you know, right now they're talking about eliminating civil service protections for a lot of governmental jobs. Well, where do people, who works in the government? People who live in Northern Virginia and Maryland is where they work. So that's going to be a tough sell, I think, there. There's some people who think Trump may even be competitive in Virginia this year, and that may be the case. I still think the Democrats are going to carry it. But next year, I think if he wins, what's going to happen, I believe, is that I think there are a lot of Republicans who are going to be scared off, or a few Republicans, for running for governor. Right now, we have the Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, says she wants to run for governor. She's announced. The Democrats have their candidate. It's Abigail Spanberger, the congresswoman. And from my perspective, she's a strong candidate for the Democrats, largely because she's already won twice in Virginia in 2 different congressional districts. She won in a congressional district that was centered in Henrico and Chesterfield. Then after redistricting, she won in a congressional district centered in Prince William. She has a very, a constituency that's very supportive of her, very motivated. She has no opposition for the Democratic nomination. She's just raising money. And the other thing is that she's done a very good job of positioning herself as what I would call a traditional, successful Democratic candidate. Progressive and liberal on the social issues, and she says she's moderate on the economic issues. And she's had that confirmed to some degree by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which supported her in her last congressional race. Republicans say, no, she votes with Nancy Pelosi all the time. She's a liberal. But Spanberger has she's just been very successful candidate that way. I do not believe that the Lieutenant Governor, Winsome Sears, can beat her, because Sears has a position on abortion that has been very with sort of pro-life without really any exceptions, and we see if that changes at all. And she's very what I'd call pro-gun, and she has taken these pictures with these AR-15s around her body. That will do well in the rural areas. That will not do well in RVA and most of the Democratic areas. So I don't think she can win. So the question then is, will anybody else on the Republican side get in the race? And I think if Trump is the president, all the other Republicans will say, I'll think about 2029 on that front. That's what I'm thinking that they will do. If Harris wins, there's going to be competition for the Republican nomination. For sure, I think, or probably, the Attorney General, Jason Miyares, will run. He's being supported right now very strongly by former Governor George Allen. And there's a chance that somebody like Glenn Youngkin from the business community might get in that race as well to try to be sort of the second term of Youngkin there, as Virginia is the one state in the country where you can't secede yourself on that front. So that's what's happening there. But here's the other thing that's important, that the government really is very different when it's divided or when it's unified. That when you have divided government, the only things that get done on the big issues are the places where they can eventually come to an agreement across the table. They may shout, they may argue, but they eventually have to get that done. They have to get a budget, they have to agree. And there's been a lot of things that have gotten done in Virginia under divided government. If you have unified government, it's different. And as I said, the only place you could have unified government in all likelihood in 2026 is if the Democrats have it. If the Democrats they have the Senate, if they keep the House and get the governorship, the Democrats would then have the same opportunity that they had in the last 2 years of the Northam administration. And here's what I would say. The Democratic Party today is probably more liberal or progressive than it might have been years ago. So that's kind of where we are in Virginia. Now, very quickly, just about a couple of issues that have come forward in the national campaign that's of interest. The first one, of course, is Kamala Harris's housing proposal. What Harris has said is that she wants 3 million new houses to be built, right? And what it is that it's her argument about, I'm for the middle class. I'm for getting more things done that have home ownership for people. It's a smart move. It's not something that the federal government controls there. She wants to give a tax deduction for first-time buyers, but at the end of the day, as many of you know, housing is availability sometimes controlled by local governments, not by federal governments. But she's pushing that because she thinks it's a very, very strong issue there, and she's pushing it for a second reason. She's pushing it that Trump has been increasing his percentage of Latino voters. Among adult Latino males, 1 in 5 work where? Construction trades on that front. And so that's a direct message there. What Harris has done on immigration is she's not talking about how bad it is. She's talking about, well, we do want to sign a bill to get a control of the border, because that's been the Democrats' big problem, lack of control of the border. She's not taking a traditional Democratic approach, but that's why she's doing sort of housing. The other issue that's connected to this, of course, is immigration. Because again, as I said, that construction trades nationally, 1 in 3 individuals in construction trades nationally is an immigrant. The highest percentage is in Texas, Florida, New York, California, where you're near 40%. Virginia is a little less than that. It's about 25% in terms of that. And so Donald Trump is saying he wants mass deportation of the immigrants. The dilemma, he says, of the undocumented immigrants. The challenge is a logistical one. 2/3 of undocumented immigrants live with a legal immigrant, somebody who is here and has all of the appropriate papers there. So it's not going to be so easy if you think about how do you go about mass deportation, how do you do it surgically? You go into a house and you take 3 people but not 2 others on that front. But the challenge there is that this issue has become so volatile that there doesn't seem to be, at least at the moment, a consensus for reaching what has to happen to make this society work well. They have to find a way to stop the mass importation at the border that's illegal. But at the same time, it's hard not to imagine that we don't need more legal immigration for the businesses that rely on that very strongly, and where people are doing all the things that you're doing to work with the community colleges and the construction trades and the like, but it just never fills the bill completely on that sense. So that issue is out there as well. And the dilemma that I see on that is, at least at the moment, we don't have enough consensus around an answer, and it's just become a huge part of the polarization of the politics here right now. So that's kind of where we are. So at the end of the day, we're in this amazing political year. We're coming up right away to a new political year in Virginia. Some people don't like the sense that we have this election every year in Virginia. They say we have just too much. I say you're crazy. I say because I call it the political pundit full employment policy on that front. Craig, thanks very much for having me here again.